For as long as anyone could remember, the corner of the living room near the window had been empty. It was a spot that caught the afternoon light perfectly, a patch of warm hardwood floor that seemed to be waiting for something special. But for years, the only thing that sat there was a fading rug and a small plastic plant that had seen better days. In the house next to that empty space lived Mrs. Gable, a woman who had spent her entire life giving pieces of herself away to others. Mrs. Gable was not a woman who asked for much. She was the kind of person who would mend a neighbor's coat before fixing her own hem, or who would give the last slice of pie to a visitor even if her own stomach was rumbling. She lived a quiet life, filled with the sounds of the neighborhood dogs barking, cars driving by, and the distant hum of the city. But if you listened closely enough, you could hear that Mrs. Gable carried her own music with her wherever she went. She hummed when she washed the dishes. She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel while she waited at red lights. She walked with a rhythm that was uniquely hers. The music in her head was loud and clear, full of complicated symphonies and soft, melancholy tunes that made her heart ache in a beautiful way. But the world around her never heard that music. It was trapped inside her. Her love for the piano started when she was just a little girl. Her family didn't have much money, in fact, they barely had enough to keep the lights on. There was certainly no money for music lessons or expensive instruments. But there was a community center a few blocks away from her childhood home. It was an old building with stone steps and a drafty hallway, but inside the main hall, there sat a massive, dark piano. It was scratched in places and some of the keys stuck when you pressed them too hard, but to Mrs. Gable, it was the most magical thing in the world. Every day after school, she would run to that community center. She didn't have a teacher, so she taught herself. She learned by listening, by closing her eyes and letting her fingers find the notes that matched the songs in her head. She learned how the pressure of a fingertip could change a sound from a soft whisper to a loud shout. She spent hours there, lost in the maze of melody, until the sun went down and the street lights flickered on. The piano was her escape. It was the place where she didn't have to worry about being poor or fitting in. She could just be. But life has a way of getting in the way of dreams. As she grew older, the responsibilities of the real world began to pile up. She needed to work to help support her family. There were bills to pay and mouths to feed. The visits to the community center became less frequent. First, she stopped going every day. Then, she stopped going every week. Eventually, she stopped going altogether. The piano was covered with a heavy cloth to protect the dust, and the door to the hall was locked. Mrs. Gable told herself it was just a break. She thought that one day, when things settled down, she would buy her own piano. She would have a house with a room just for music. But one day turned into years, and the years turned into decades. Mrs. Gable got married. She had children. She raised them with the same love and care that she once put into her music. She was a wonderful mother, always present, always listening. But as her children grew up and moved out to start their own lives, the house grew quieter. The noise of playing, laughing, and cooking faded away. And in that silence, the empty corner by the window seemed to get bigger. Her husband was a good man, but he wasn't one for sentimental things. He was practical. He knew she liked music, and he would buy her records or listen to the radio with her, but he didn't understand the deep, pulling need she felt to create the music herself. To him, a piano was just a large piece of furniture that collected dust and cost money to tune. Whenever she mentioned it, he would smile and nod, but then he would talk about the car needing new tires or the roof needing a fix. So, she learned to keep the desire to herself. She pushed it down deep, burying it under grocery lists and work schedules. As she aged, Mrs. Gable developed a routine. She would wake up early, make coffee, and sit in her favorite armchair. From her chair, she could see that empty spot in the corner. Sometimes, she would stare at it for so long that her coffee would go cold. In her mind, she wasn't looking at a bare floor. She was picturing a glossy black piano sitting right there. She could imagine the sunlight reflecting off the side of it. She could practically smell the wax and wood. More than anything, she could feel the keys. Her fingers, now wrinkled and a bit stiff with arthritis, would twitch on her lap. She remembered the feeling of the ivory, the resistance of the strings, the vibration that traveled up her arm and into her chest when she played a chord. It was a physical ache, a hunger that wouldn't go away. Her neighbors didn't know about this dream. To them, she was just the nice old lady who lived in the beige house. They didn't know that she was a musician without an instrument. They didn't know that every time she walked past a music store in the mall, she had to stop and stare, pressing her hand against the glass to feel closer to the world she missed. It wasn't just about playing songs. It was about expressing a part of herself that had been silent for too long. She had so much stored up inside her, years of joy, years of sorrow, years of love and loss. Music was the only way she knew how to let it all out. Without it, she felt like a letter that had been written but never put in the mail. Full of words, but never read. There were days when the temptation to just buy one was almost too strong to resist. She had saved a little bit of money over the years, a rainy day fund hidden in the back of her dresser. She knew it wasn't enough for anything fancy, but maybe it was enough for something used. Something small. But then she would look at her bank statement, or she would think about the future, and she would talk herself out of it. It's too late now, she would tell herself. I'm too old. My hands don't work like they used to. Who am I kidding? She was afraid that if she finally sat down in front of a piano again, the magic would be gone. Maybe she had forgotten how to play. Maybe her hands were too clumsy. The fear of failure was just as strong as the desire to play. So, she stayed in her safe routine, humming softly, keeping her secret dream locked away in the empty corner of the room. Then came the year everything changed. It was a hard year. Mrs. Gable didn't feel as strong as she used to. The cold weather bothered her joints more than usual. She spent more time inside looking out the window. She realized that time wasn't something she had an endless supply of anymore. The feeling of regret began to mix with her longing. She looked back at her life and saw a long line of sacrifices she had made for others. She didn't resent them. She loved her family and would do it all again, but she wondered if there was still a small piece of the puzzle left for her. Her son, a kind man named David who lived a few hours away, came to visit one weekend. He noticed his mother seemed quieter than usual. He watched her as she moved around the kitchen, preparing dinner. He saw how she paused for a long time by the window, looking at nothing in particular. He saw the way she rubbed her fingers together when she thought no one was looking, as if she was trying to warm them up or feel something that wasn't there. David didn't know the full extent of the dream, but he knew his mother. He knew she had a melody in her heart that had been waiting a long time to be heard. As he drove away that Sunday afternoon, he couldn't shake the image of her standing by that empty wall. It looked like a missing piece in a puzzle. The house was full of furniture, but it felt incomplete. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. It was waiting to be filled. Back in her quiet house, Mrs. Gable cleaned up the dishes from dinner. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. She walked into the living room and stood in her usual spot. She hummed a few bars of an old song, her voice raspy but true. She looked at the empty space one last time before turning off the lamp. She didn't know that her son was making phone calls as he drove. She didn't know that the silence was about to break. She just went to bed, as she had done for thousands of nights before, with the music still playing softly in her dreams, waiting for the morning. The weeks that followed David's visit were quiet, just like all the other weeks in Mrs. Gable's life. The leaves outside turned from bright green to rusty gold and began to fall, covering the sidewalk in a crunchy carpet. Mrs. Gable spent her days doing the usual things: watering the plants that refused to grow very tall, dusting the frames of family photos, and listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The house felt safe, but it also felt very still. That empty spot by the window remained empty, gathering dust that she wiped away every few days, just in case. She had mostly made peace with the idea that her dream was just that, a dream. It is a hard thing to accept, that there are some wishes that don't come true, but Mrs. Gable was a practical woman. She had lived through real hardships. She knew how to be strong. She told herself that listening to the radio was enough. She told herself that humming while she knitted was enough. But late at night, when the house was dark and the only sound was the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, her hands would still move on top of the quilt. They played silent songs that no one could hear. Then, on a Tuesday morning that looked exactly like any other Tuesday, everything changed. Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen, waiting for her toast to pop up. She was staring out the back window at the birds fighting over a piece of bread, when a loud noise rumbled through the quiet street. It was the deep, grumbling sound of a heavy truck engine. It grew louder and louder until it sounded like it was right outside her front gate. She frowned a little, wondering if a delivery truck had made a wrong turn. Her street was narrow, big trucks rarely came down it unless they were bringing something for a neighbor. The toast popped up, startling her, but she ignored it. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front window to see what was going on. She pulled back the sheer curtain and peered out. Parked directly in front of her house was a large moving truck. It was white with a logo on the side that she didn't quite recognize. The engine was still running, puffing a little cloud of white smoke into the crisp air. Mrs. Gable felt a flutter of confusion. She wasn't expecting anyone. She wasn't moving. She watched as the driver's door opened and a man in a blue uniform stepped out. He walked around to the back of the truck and lowered the metal ramp. Then, to her complete surprise, her son David got out of his car, which was parked behind the truck. He looked a bit nervous, checking his watch and then looking up at the house. Her heart gave a little thump. David rarely visited on a Tuesday without calling first. She opened the front door and stepped out onto the small porch, clutching her sweater around her shoulders against the morning chill. "David," she called out. "What is all this? Is everything all right?" David turned to look at her, and his face broke into a wide, nervous smile. He walked up the path, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Hey, Mom," he said. He sounded breathless, like he had been running. "You need to come inside for a minute. Or, well, actually, you need to stand back." "Stand back?" Mrs. Gable asked, laughing a little in confusion. "David, what are you talking about? Is this for the neighbors?" "It's not for the neighbors, Mom," David said. He stepped closer and took her hand gently. "It's for you. For us. Just, wait right here." He guided her back to the porch but didn't let her go inside. He just made her stand near the railing. The two men from the moving truck were already busy behind him. Mrs. Gable watched, puzzled, as they disappeared around the side of the truck. She could hear the sound of heavy things being moved, the clanking of metal, and the sound of wheels rolling on the pavement. "I don't understand," she said, looking at her son. "I haven't ordered anything." "I know you haven't," David said softly. He couldn't look her in the eye, he was staring at the truck. "I remember, Mom. I remember when I was little. You used to hum that same song over and over. And I remember you telling me once, a long time ago, that the only thing you ever truly wanted for yourself was a piano. A real one. Not a picture, not a radio. A real one that you could play." Mrs. Gable went still. The air around her suddenly felt very cold and very sharp. She looked at David, her mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. She hadn't talked about that in years. She hadn't even let herself think about it in that specific way for a long time. "David," she whispered. "You can't be serious." "I am," he said. "I've been saving up. It took a while. I found a place that restores them. It's used, Mom, but it's beautiful. They said the sound is incredible." Just then, the two movers appeared around the side of the truck. They were carrying the biggest object Mrs. Gable had seen in a very long time. It was a piano. But it wasn't just any piano. It was a glossy, deep brown upright piano, the kind that seemed to hold the history of music inside its wooden frame. The sunlight hit the shiny surface, making it gleam like polished glass. It was big, heavy, and magnificent. Mrs. Gable let out a small gasp. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth. "Watch your step, gentlemen," David said, his voice sounding commanding and protective. The movers navigated the walkway carefully, grunting slightly with the weight of the instrument. Mrs. Gable stood frozen on the porch, her eyes wide as saucers. She watched as they carried her dream right up her front steps. The wood creaked under their boots as they reached the top. "Ma'am, could you open the screen door, please?" one of the movers asked kindly. Mrs. Gable realized she was blocking the way. She snapped out of her trance and fumbled with the latch, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely get it open. Sorry," she stammered, stepping back into the hallway. They carried it inside. The house, which usually felt so spacious and empty, suddenly felt very full. The movers moved slowly, shuffling their feet to keep their balance. They turned the piano sideways to get it through the front entrance, and as they did, Mrs. Gable could smell it. It had a specific scent, a mixture of old wood, wax, felt, and dust. It was the scent of history. It was the scent of every song she had ever loved. "Where do you want it?" the lead mover asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. David looked at his mother. She was standing in the middle of the hall, looking small next to the towering instrument. "Right there," she whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the living room. "In the corner. By the window." It was the spot that had been waiting for 40 years. The movers nodded and maneuvered the piano into the living room. They set it down gently onto the floor. Mrs. Gable winced as the legs touched the ground, worried it might scratch the wood, but it landed with a solid, heavy thud. It didn't look like a piece of furniture anymore, it looked like it had grown there, like a tree that had finally found its roots. The movers brought in the bench next. It was a simple wooden bench with a padded seat. They placed it in front of the keys, adjusted the distance, and then stood back to admire their work. "All right then," the lead mover said, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's all set." That's a fine piece of machinery you got there, ma'am. Mrs. Gable nodded, but she couldn't speak. She was afraid if she opened her mouth, she would start crying, and she didn't want to cry in front of the movers. They packed up their gear, gathered their paperwork for David to sign, and walked out. The silence returned to the house, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence that was waiting to be broken. David closed the front door behind them and locked it. Then he turned to look at his mother. She was standing in front of the piano, but she wasn't touching it yet. She was just looking at it, taking in the curves of the wood, the sharp black keys against the white, the way the morning light reflected off the side. "Do you like it?" David asked. He sounded worried, like he was scared he had made a mistake. Mrs. Gable reached out. Her hand hovered over the lid for a moment, trembling. She touched the cool, smooth wood. It felt solid and real. She ran her fingers down the side, feeling the texture. "It's..." She stopped and cleared her throat, her voice thick with emotion. "It's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." David let out a long breath he had been holding. He walked over and put his arm around her shoulders. "I'm glad, Mom. You deserve it. You really do." She turned to him then, and the tears did come. They weren't sad tears. They were the tears of a dam breaking after holding back a flood for a lifetime. She hugged her son tightly, burying her face in his jacket. "Thank you," she whispered over and over again. "Thank you." They stood there for a long time, the three of them, Mrs. Gable, David, and the piano. Eventually, David had to leave to get back to work, but she didn't mind. She wasn't lonely anymore. When he was gone, Mrs. Gable sat down on the bench. It creaked slightly under her weight. She sat up straight, just like she had seen professionals do when she was a girl. She looked at the keyboard. 88 keys. Some of them were slightly yellowed with age, but they looked clean and inviting. She lifted her hands. They were old hands now, with thin skin and veins that showed through blue. Her knuckles were a bit swollen. She looked at them for a moment, feeling a sudden pang of doubt. It had been so long. Could she still do it? Was the music still in there, or had it faded away? The fear came rushing back, the fear that she would try and nothing would happen. But she pushed the fear down. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smell of the old wood. She wasn't asking for a concert performance. She just wanted to say hello. With a slow, deliberate movement, she pressed down the middle C key. The sound was clear and bright, ringing through the quiet room and bouncing off the walls. It wasn't a perfect tone, but it was real. It vibrated through her finger, up her arm, and settled right in the center of her chest. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She held her breath, letting the note fade into silence, a smile spreading across her face that didn't go away for the rest of the day. For the first few days, the piano sat in the corner like a beautiful piece of art in a museum. It was the most wonderful thing Mrs. Gable had ever owned, and she treated it with a mix of deep reverence and nervous fear. Every morning, she would walk into the living room with her coffee and just look at it. The way the morning sun hit the glossy brown wood made it look like it was glowing from the inside out. She would dust it gently with a soft cloth, making sure not to leave a single streak on the surface, and then she would just sit on the bench for a while, breathing in the smell of varnish and old felt. It was enough, at first, just to have it there. The empty space in the room had finally been filled. The house felt complete. But as the days turned into a week, the silence in the room began to change. The piano was no longer just a beautiful object, it was an invitation. It was sitting there, waiting. The keys seemed to look up at her, asking a question that she was afraid to answer. Are you going to play us, or are we just going to sit here and look pretty? Mrs. Gable knew she had to try. She had spent a lifetime dreaming about this moment. Every time she had washed dishes or driven her car, she had been practicing in her head. She knew exactly how the songs should sound. She knew the rhythm, the melody, and the emotion. In her mind, her fingers were strong and fast, flying across the keys like birds. In her mind, she was a master. One Tuesday afternoon, the house was particularly quiet. The neighbors were at work, and the street outside was still. Mrs. Gable felt a surge of courage. She walked over to the piano, opened the lid to reveal the keys, and sat down on the bench. She straightened her back, just like she had seen the pianists do in the old movies. She shook her hands out at her sides, trying to loosen up her muscles. Okay, she said out loud to the empty room. Just a simple scale. Up and down. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. Her right hand hovered over the middle of the keyboard. She took a deep breath, visualized the notes in her head, and pressed her thumb down on the middle C. The note rang out clear and strong. Good. She moved to the next finger, then the next. But that is where the magic stopped. Instead of the smooth, flowing flow of water she expected, the sound that came out was jagged and uneven. Her fingers, which felt stiff and heavy, didn't want to move independently. When she tried to play fast, they tripped over each other, hitting two keys at once. The sound was jarring, a discordant crash that made her wince. She pulled her hands back as if she had touched a hot stove. She stared at her hands, turning them over and looking at her palms. They were the hands of an older woman. The skin was thin and paper-like, mapped with veins that stood out blue against the pale skin. Her knuckles were swollen and red, a constant reminder of the arthritis that had been slowly creeping into her joints over the years. For a long time, she had ignored the stiffness, blaming it on the cold weather or sleeping in a weird position. But now, faced with the demanding precision of the piano, she couldn't ignore it anymore. It's just because I'm nervous, she told herself, trying to push away the panic rising in her chest. I just need to warm up. It's been a long time. She tried again. This time, she attempted a simple melody, a folk song she had known since she was a child. It was a song that required a gentle, rocking rhythm. She started off okay, but as she moved her hand up the keyboard to reach the higher notes, her pinky finger refused to stretch. It stayed curled tight, stiff, and uncooperative. The note came out wrong, ruining the tune. She forced the finger down, gritting her teeth against the sharp pain that shot through her knuckle. She managed to hit the key, but the rhythm was lost. She stopped again, her heart pounding. She tried a third time. And a fourth. Each attempt was worse than the one before it. Her hands were shaking now, not from emotion, but from the sheer physical effort of trying to force them to obey. It felt like she was wearing thick, heavy gloves. She could feel the music in her head, loud and clear, but there was a broken disconnect between her brain and her fingers. The signal was getting lost along the way. After 20 minutes, Mrs. Gable slammed the lid of the keyboard down harder than she meant to. The loud bang echoed through the house, startling the cat who had been sleeping on the rug. She put her face in her hands and let out a long, shaky sob. It wasn't a cry of pain, exactly, but a cry of profound disappointment. It was the sound of a bubble bursting. For 40 years, she had held onto this dream. She had told herself that if she just had the piano, everything would fall into place. She thought the music would pour out of her naturally, like water from a spring. She had romanticized the idea of sitting in her living room in the evenings, filling the house with beautiful music while the sun went down. Reality was cruel. The reality was that she had waited too long. She had sacrificed her prime years for other things, and while she didn't regret loving her family, she regretted not loving herself enough to keep playing. The dream wasn't just deferred, it was dead. She had the instrument, but she had lost the ability to use it. She sat there for a long time, the humiliation burning her cheeks. She felt foolish. She felt like a fraud. What was the point of having this beautiful, expensive machine sitting in her living room if the only sound it made was a clumsy, stumbling mess? Mrs. Gable stood up from the bench, her body feeling heavy and exhausted. She walked out of the living room and went into the kitchen, leaving the piano behind her. She didn't look back. For the next few days, she couldn't even bring herself to walk past that corner of the room. She would enter the house through the back door or keep her eyes strictly on the floor whenever she had to go to the kitchen. The piano became a monument to her failure. Every time she saw it out of the corner of her eye, it felt like it was mocking her. It reminded her of her own mortality, of the things she can no longer do. The silence in the house was heavier now than it had been before the piano arrived. Before, the silence was empty space waiting to be filled. Now, the silence was full of judgment. David came to visit a few days later. He walked in with a big smile, expecting to hear her practicing. He stopped in the hallway, looking around. "Mom," he called out. "I don't hear anything. Are you playing?" Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing a pot that was already clean. She didn't turn around. "No," she said shortly. "I'm not." David walked into the kitchen, leaning against the frame. He looked confused. "Why not? Did something happen to the piano? Is it out of tune?" "It's fine," she said, her voice tight. "It's perfect. It's exactly what I wanted." "Then why the long face?" She stopped scrubbing and threw the sponge into the sink with a wet slap. She turned to look at her son, tears welling up in her eyes again, which frustrated her even more. She hated feeling this weak. "Because I can't do it, David," she admitted, her voice cracking. I tried, and my hands, they won't work. They're old. They're stiff. I sound like a child. No, worse than a child. I sound like I'm banging on trash cans." David's face softened. He walked over to her. "Mom, it's only been a few days. You just need to practice. You haven't played in years." "It's not about practice," she snapped, pulling away from him. "It's gone. The talent is gone. My body is too old. I waited too long." She slumped against the counter, the fight draining out of her. "It's a cruel joke, really. I finally get what I wanted, and I don't have the tools to enjoy it. It's just a piece of furniture now. A very expensive dust collector." David didn't know what to say. He looked toward the living room, at the dark silhouette of the piano in the corner. He felt terrible. He had wanted to give her joy, not sorrow. He had wanted to fix a regret, not highlight it. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "Don't be," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You did a wonderful thing. It's not your fault I'm too broken to play it." She turned back to the sink, signaling that the conversation was over. David stayed for a little while longer, trying to make small talk, but the mood was ruined. When he left, Mrs. Gable felt a sense of relief. She didn't want an audience for her pity party. That evening, as the sun began to set, the house grew dark. Mrs. Gable didn't turn on the lamps. She sat in her armchair, facing away from the piano. The room was bathed in shadows. She felt a deep, aching hollowness in her chest. It was one thing to never have a dream come true. It was another thing entirely to have it come true and realize it was impossible to keep. She listened to the wind whistling outside the window. She remembered the music she used to hear in her head, the symphonies and the sonatas. They seemed distant now, like echoes from another life. She closed her eyes, resigned to the fact that the music would remain silent, trapped inside her with nowhere to go. The piano would sit there, beautiful and silent, waiting for a player who no longer existed. David stayed in the doorway of the kitchen for a long time, leaning his shoulder against the frame. He watched his mother as she aggressively scrubbed a pot that was already spotless. The sound of the metal sponge rubbing against the steel was harsh and loud in the quiet house. He could see the tension in her back, the way her shoulders were hunched up near her ears. She was angry, but he knew it wasn't at him. It was a worse kind of anger, the kind that comes from disappointment. It was the anger of realizing that time had moved on without her. He felt a heavy knot form in his own stomach. He had worked so hard for this. He had taken extra shifts, skipped vacations, and eaten countless packed lunches just to save up enough money to buy that instrument. He had pictured this moment 1,000 times. In his daydreams, he would come home to find the house filled with music. He imagined his mother sitting with perfect posture, her eyes closed, lost in a world of melody while the afternoon sun streamed in. He thought he was buying her happiness. He didn't realize he might have just bought her a monument to her own limitations. "Mom," he said softly, trying to break through the sound of her scrubbing. She didn't stop. "It's fine, David. Please. Just drop it. I'm tired." "You aren't tired," he said, pushing himself off the door frame and walking into the room. "You're embarrassed. And you're frustrated." She stopped scrubbing then, but she didn't turn around. She gripped the edge of the sink so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Of course I'm frustrated. Wouldn't you be to hold something in your heart for 40 years, only to find out you're too broken to touch it? It's humiliating." David walked over and gently put his hand on her shoulder. He could feel how fragile she felt under his grip. She was shrinking, he realized. His mother, who used to seem like a giant to him, was getting smaller every year. "You aren't broken," he said firmly. "You're just rusty. And your hands are stiff. That happens. It happens to people who give up," she snapped back, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "I should have kept playing. I shouldn't have waited. But I can't change that now, can I? The piano is there, and I am here, and the two of them don't work anymore." David looked past her, down the hallway toward the living room. He could see the corner of the piano gleaming in the shadows. It looked lonely. "Play for me," he said. Mrs. Gable let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "I just told you, David. I can't." It sounded awful. "You don't want to hear that." "I don't care if it sounds awful," he said. "I want to hear you try." "No. Mom, please." She shook her head and turned back to the sink. "No. I'm done. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I'm going to finish these dishes and go to bed." David stood there for a moment, feeling helpless. He knew that stubborn streak. She got it from her own mother, and he had probably inherited a bit of it too. Once she made up her mind that she was a failure, there was no talking her out of it. Logic didn't work. Comfort didn't work. She just had to sit in it for a while. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. I won't push." She didn't say anything, just turned the water on to rinse the pot. The sound of the rushing water filled the silence between them. David hesitated. He wanted to do something, anything, to fix the heavy mood in the house. He looked toward the living room again. An idea sparked in the back of his mind. It was a crazy idea, something he hadn't thought about in years. He wasn't sure if it would help or if it would just make things worse, but he couldn't just stand there and watch her suffer. He walked out of the kitchen and headed down the hall. Mrs. Gable watched him go, wondering what he was doing. She heard his footsteps on the hardwood floor. She heard him stop. And then, she heard the creak of the piano bench. Her heart skipped a beat. She dropped the sponge into the water with a splash and dried her hands quickly on a towel. "David, what are you doing?" "Nothing," his voice floated back to her. "Just looking." She wiped her eyes and walked slowly out of the kitchen. She stood in the doorway of the living room, leaning against the frame. David was sitting on the bench. He looked huge sitting there. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and tall, with hands that looked like they could crush rocks. He spent his days working with heavy machinery and construction materials. His skin was rough and tanned, permanently stained with grease and oil in the creases of his palms. His fingernails were short and jagged. He didn't look like a musician. He looked like a laborer. He reached out and touched the keys gently. It was such a strange sight to see those rough, weathered hands resting on the pristine white and black keys. It looked like a mistake. It looked like two different worlds colliding. "Be careful," Mrs. Gable said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't bang on it." "I won't," David said. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the keyboard with a strange intensity. "I don't even know why you're sitting there," she grumbled, crossing her arms over her chest. "You've never played a day in your life. You're going to just make noise." David smiled a little, but he still didn't turn around. "You think so?" "I know so," she said. "You take after your father. No rhythm at all. He couldn't even clap on beat." David chuckled softly. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I have no rhythm." He placed his right hand on the keys. He hovered his fingers for a second, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mrs. Gable prepared herself for a chaotic noise. She expected him to slam his hands down, to play a jarring chopsticks or just bang out a random noise to try to make her laugh. That was the kind of thing he did. He was the joker, the one who tried to lighten the mood with humor. But he didn't bang. He didn't slam. He pressed a single key. It was a low note, deep and resonant. Then, he pressed another one, higher up. He played a third note. And then, his left hand moved. Mrs. Gable froze. Her arms uncrossed and fell to her sides. The notes that came out weren't random. They were connected. They were part of a chord. It was a simple, steady progression, dark and moody. David wasn't looking at his hands. He was playing by feel, his eyes closed. He began to play a melody. It wasn't chopsticks. It wasn't Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It was the song. It was the exact same melody Mrs. Gable had been humming for 40 years. It was the tune she used to sing to him when he was a baby, the one she hummed while she cooked dinner, the one she whistled while she worked in the garden. It was a complex, melancholic folk song that had been passed down in their family for generations. She hadn't played it on the piano since she was a young woman, but she hummed it constantly. David played it perfectly. Well, perfectly might have been the wrong word to a classical expert. His technique was rough. He didn't curve his fingers the way the book said you should. He pressed the keys with a heavy, flat attack that made the piano sound louder and more robust than it was meant to. But the rhythm was flawless. The timing was exact. And the feeling was overwhelming. Mrs. Gable felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She took a shaky step forward, her eyes locked on her son's hands. How she breathed. How do you know that? David didn't stop playing. The music filled the room, bouncing off the walls, swirling around the dust motes in the air. It sounded different coming from him. It wasn't delicate and precise like it would have been if she played it. It was strong. It sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like the earth. I told you, David said, his voice calm and steady, keeping time with the music. I've been listening to you my whole life. I know every song you hum. I know when you're happy, the tune goes up. I know when you're sad, it goes down. I memorized the melodies because they were the sound of you caring for me. He added a harmony with his left hand, filling in the bass notes. It wasn't just a simple line anymore, it was a rich, full arrangement. He was improvising, filling in the gaps, making the song bigger than it had ever been before. Mrs. Gable walked closer until she was standing right behind the bench. She looked down at his hands. They were so big, moving with a surprising grace. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the calluses on his fingertips, the grease under the nails that soap never quite seemed to remove. Those were the hands that had held him when he scraped his knee. Those were the hands that had waved goodbye as he got on the school bus. Those were the hands that had worked tirelessly to provide for his own family. And now, those hands were giving her back her music. Tears began to stream down her face, unchecked and fast. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't care. She watched as his rough fingers danced over the ivory keys, finding the notes she had thought were lost to time. He wasn't reading music. He wasn't thinking about theory or scales. He was just playing. He was playing the love he felt for her. The song went on. It was a long piece, and he knew every twist and turn. He played the soft, quiet parts gently, and he played the loud, dramatic parts with a force that made the piano vibrate against the floor. He was putting his own soul into the instrument. He was telling her a story without using a single word. The story he told was this: I heard you. Even when you didn't think anyone was listening, I heard you. And I kept your music safe inside me until now. Mrs. Gable reached out and rested her hand on David's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He leaned back into her touch slightly, never missing a beat. The connection between them was palpable, a physical thing that hummed in the air between them. The silence that had been suffocating the house was gone. In its place was a sound so beautiful, so heartbreakingly pure, that it felt like a miracle. She realized then that she had been wrong. She hadn't waited too long. She hadn't lost the music. She had just been holding it for him. She was the keeper of the melody, but he was becoming the instrument. The music hadn't died, it had evolved. It had grown up, just like he had. As the song began to slow down, moving toward the final, resolving chords, Mrs. Gable felt a sense of peace wash over her that she hadn't felt in decades. The shame, the frustration, The feeling of being too old and broken, it all melted away. None of that mattered. The music was here. It was alive. David played the last chord, letting the notes ring out into the silence before fading away. He lifted his hands off the keys and set them on his lap. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was a warm, glowing silence. David turned around on the bench to look up at her. He saw her tear-streaked face and smiled, a little shyly. "I told you I had rhythm," he said softly. Mrs. Gable let out a wet laugh, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan. She looked at this man, her son, with a new sense of wonder. "You certainly do," she whispered. "You certainly do." The last notes of the song seemed to hang in the air for a long time, even after the strings inside the piano had stopped vibrating. The room felt different now. It wasn't just a room with a piano in it anymore. It felt like a sanctuary. The heavy cloud of disappointment that had been weighing down Mrs. Gable's spirit had completely vanished, replaced by a feeling of lightness that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. Mrs. Gable sat down on the bench next to her son. It was a tight fit because the bench wasn't made for two grown people, especially two people with a bond as big as theirs. She didn't say a word at first. She just reached over and took one of his large, rough hands in both of hers. She turned it over, palm up, and traced the lines on his skin with her thumb. She looked at the calluses, the scars, and the dirt that seemed to be a permanent part of his fingerprint. These were the hands of a man who worked with his back and his strength, not a man who sat in concert halls wearing tuxedos. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "All those years. I thought I was just humming to myself. I thought I was just annoying the neighbors with my noise." David squeezed her fingers back gently. "You weren't making noise, Mom. You were teaching me. I didn't even realize I was learning it. It just sort of got in there." He tapped his temple with his free hand. "Whenever I was scared, or when I had a bad day at school, or when things were tough with Dad and we were arguing, I would just remember that tune. It was like a safe place for me, too. I never told you because I didn't want to sound weird, but I've been playing this song in my head since I was a little kid." Mrs. Gable felt a fresh wave of tears, but these were warm and comforting. She looked at the keyboard, then back at him. "Your technique is terrible," she said, a teasing smile finally breaking through her sadness. David laughed out loud, a booming sound that filled the room. "I know it is. I'm just smashing the keys. I don't know what I'm doing." "It doesn't matter," she said firmly. "You have the one thing they can't teach in a school. You have the feeling. You have the story. And that is the only thing that matters." They sat there together for a while, side by side, looking at the instrument that had brought them to this moment. It was no longer a symbol of what Mrs. Gable had lost. It was a bridge connecting her past to his present, and to their future. She realized something profound in that quiet moment. She had spent so many years grieving the fact that she couldn't be the one to play the music. She had been so focused on her own limitations that she hadn't noticed that the music had found a new home. It hadn't disappeared. It had just moved. It was living inside her son, waiting for the right moment to come out. "You know," Mrs. Gable said, breaking the silence. "I think we need to make a deal." David looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of deal?" "This piano is not going to sit here collecting dust," she said, patting the glossy wood. "I can't play the way I used to. My hands are too stiff. That is just the reality. But I can still teach you the notes." I can teach you how to read the music, the proper names for the chords, and how to hold your hands so they don't cramp up. And in exchange, you have to promise to play for me every time you come over." David smiled, but there was a serious look in his eyes. "You'd really teach me after all these years?" "There is nothing I would rather do," she answered truthfully. "I can't make the music dance anymore, David. But I can be the one who shows you where to put your feet. It's time for you to lead." He nodded slowly. "I'd like that. I really would. It would give me a reason to get out of the house on weekends instead of just watching TV. And besides," Mrs. Gable added, wiping her eyes one last time and straightening her posture, "I refuse to let this beautiful instrument go to waste. If I can't play it, then my son is going to be the best piano player on the block." They both laughed, and the sound was easy and natural. The tension that had filled the house for the past week was completely gone. Over the next few months, the house changed. It became a place of learning and noise again, but it was good noise. David started coming over regularly. He would bring a pizza or some groceries, and they would sit at the piano for hours. At first, it was difficult. Mrs. Gable would sit next to him and guide his hands. She would use a pencil to tap on the keys to show him the rhythm. "No, no, no," she would say gently. "That finger is curved like a claw. Relax it. Let it breathe." David was patient, though. He was a construction worker, so he was used to building things piece by piece. He treated learning the piano like building a house. You had to start with the foundation. He learned the scales. He learned the names of the notes. He learned how to control the volume, going from a whisper-soft pianissimo to a loud, booming forte. There were plenty of mistakes. There were times when he would get frustrated and hit a wrong chord, making them both jump. But Mrs. Gable never got discouraged. She realized that this was her second chance. Watching him learn was just as fulfilling as playing herself. When he finally mastered a difficult passage, she felt a surge of pride that was even better than if she had played it herself, because it was something they were doing together. One evening, a few months later, the sun was setting just like it had on the day the piano arrived. The living room was glowing with that golden, late afternoon light. David was in the middle of practicing a more complicated piece. He wasn't just relying on his memory or humming anymore, he was reading the sheet music his mother had laid out on the stand. His fingers were moving with a confidence that hadn't been there before. He still didn't have the delicate touch of a concert pianist. His style was still powerful and heavy, but he was playing clean, clear notes. Mrs. Gable was sitting in her armchair, knitting a scarf. She wasn't correcting him anymore. She was just listening. She watched his large hands moving across the keys, and she thought about how life works in mysterious ways. She had spent 40 years wishing for a piano so she could express herself. She thought the dream was about her ego, about her talent, and about her desire to create something beautiful. She thought she had failed because she couldn't be the star of the show. But looking at David now, seeing the peace on his face as he played, she understood the truth. The piano hadn't come into her life for her sake alone. It had come for them. The music had skipped a generation in a way. It had lived inside her as a hope, and now it was living inside him as a reality. She wasn't the performer anymore, she was the conductor. She was the guide. And in a way, that was even more important. She was passing down a piece of her soul that would live on long after she was gone. As the song came to an end, David hit the final chords with a satisfying resonance. He lifted his hands and looked over at his mother, grinning. How was that, he asked. Did I get the rhythm right that time? Mrs. Gable put down her knitting. She looked at the empty corner of the room that had caused her so much pain, and then she looked at the piano, and finally at her son. It was perfect, she said softly. It was absolutely perfect. She stood up and walked over to the piano. She ran her hand along the top of it, feeling the smooth wood. You know, David, she said. I used to think that getting this piano was the end of a journey. I thought it was the finish line. But I was wrong. This isn't the end. This is just the beginning. David nodded, closing the lid over the keys. Yeah. I think you're right. And one day, Mrs. Gable added, a playful glint returning to her eyes. One day, you are going to have to teach your children. Or grandchildren. The music has to keep going. That's the rule now. David laughed, standing up and stretching his back. That's a long way off, Mom. But okay. If I have kids, I'll teach them. I'll tell them where the music came from. I'll tell them about the grandmother who had a song in her heart that wouldn't quit. Mrs. Gable smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the setting sun or the heater. She felt complete. That sounds like a good plan, she said. But for now, let's go get some tea. My student has worked hard enough today. The house settled into the evening, quiet and still. But the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't waiting to be filled. It was peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes after a really good song, when you know the music is still there, floating in the air around you, just waiting to be played again. Mrs. Gable finally had the piano she had dreamed of. And what her son played shocked everyone, but most importantly, it had healed the quiet parts of her heart she thought were broken forever.